This is the story of the Little Mermaid. Far out to sea, the water is as blue as the petals of the loveliest cornflower, and as clear as the purest glass. But it's very deep, deeper than any anchor will go. Many church towers would have to be placed one on top of the other to reach from the bottom above the surface. Down there live the mermen. Now we must not think that there's only bare sand at the bottom. No, the most wonderful trees and plants grow there, with stalks and leaves which bend so easily that they move at the slightest stir of the water, as though they were alive. All the fishes, big ones and little ones, dart among the branches like birds up in the air. At the very deepest point stands the palace of the Merman King. The walls are of coral, and the long pointed windows of the very clearest amber, while the roof is made of cockle shells, and they open and shut with the flowing water. It looks lovely, for in every one there are sparkling pearls, each of which would make a show in a queen's crown. Now the king of the mermen had for many years been a widower, but his mother kept house for him. She was a clever woman, though proud of her noble birth, for which she wore 12 oysters on her tail. Other persons of rank were only allowed 6. Apart from this, she deserved much praise, especially because she was so fond of the little mermaid princesses, her granddaughters. They were 6 lovely children, the youngest being the prettiest of them all. Her skin was as clear and as pure as a rose petal, her eyes as blue as the deepest lake. But, like all the others, she had no feet. Her body ended in a fish's tail. All day long they would play in the palace down there, in the large halls where real flowers grew out of the walls. The big amber windows would be thrown open, and the fishes would swim into them, just as swallows fly into us when we open the window. Only the fishes would swim right up to the little princesses, eat out of their hands, and allow themselves to be stroked. Outside the palace was a big garden where there were big, bright red and dark blue trees. The fruit flashed like gold, and the flowers like a blazing fire, and they were always moving their stalks and leaves. The ground itself was of the finest sand, but as blue as sulphur flames. Everything down there shone with a strange blue light. You would really have thought that you were standing high up in the air, seeing only sky above and beneath you, instead of being at the bottom of the sea. In perfect calm, you could make out the sun, which seemed like a purple flower, with all the light pouring from its cup. Each one of the small princesses had her own little plot in the garden, where she could dig and plant to her heart's content. One would make her flower bed the shape of a whale. Another liked hers to resemble the little mermaid. While the youngest, well, she made hers perfectly round like the sun and grew only flowers which glowed red like it. She was a strange child, quiet and thoughtful. And while the other sisters decorated their gardens with the most beautiful things which they had gotten from wrecked ships, all she would have, besides the red rose flowers that resembled the sun far above, was a pretty marble statue. A lovely boy carved out of a clear white stone, which had fallen to the bottom from a wreck. Besides the statue, she planted a rose-red weeping willow, and it grew splendidly, its fresh branches overhanging the statue and reaching down to the blue sandy bottom, where the shadow shone violet and stirred like the branches. It looked as though top and roots were playing at kissing each other. Nothing pleased her more than hearing about the world of people above them. Her old grandmother had to tell her all she knew about ships and towns, human beings and animals. And she thought it especially lovely that up on earth the flowers were scented, because they were not scented on the bottom of the sea, and that the woods were green, and that fishes seemed to be among the branches, and that they could sing so loudly and beautifully that it was such a delight to hear them. They were actually the little birds which their grandmother called fishes, for otherwise they would never have understood her, never having seen a bird.
When you're 15,
said the grandmother,
you may rise to the surface and sit on the rocks in the moonlight and watch the big ships sail by. You shall see woods and towns.
the following year one of the sisters was 15, while the others, well, each was a year younger than the next, so that the youngest of them had 5 whole years to wait before she was allowed to come up from the bottom and see what it looked like there. But each promised to tell the rest what she had seen and thought loveliest on the first day. For their grandmother never told them enough, and there was so much they wanted to know about. None was so full of longing as the youngest, the very one who had the longest to wait, and who was so quiet and thoughtful. Many a night she would stand at an open window looking up through the dark blue water where the fishes flicked their fins and tails. She would see the moon and the stars shining rather palely indeed, but looking much bigger when seen through the water than they do to us. If what seemed like a black cloud floated beneath them, she knew that it was either a whale swimming over her or a ship full of people. They can never have imagined that a lovely little mermaid stood below, stretching her white hands upwards toward the keel. By this time, the eldest princess was 15 and was allowed to rise to the surface. She had 100 things to tell about when she returned, but the loveliest of all, she said, was to lie in the moonlight on a sand bank in the calm sea, waiting from close inshore the big city where the lights twinkled like 100 stars, listening to the music and the sounds and noises of carriages and people, seeing all the church towers and spires, and hearing the ringing of bells. For the very reason that she could not go there, this was what she most longed for. Oh, how the youngest sister used to listen! And afterwards, when she stood at the open window in the evening looking up through the dark blue water, she would think of the big city with all its noise and bustle, and then she would fancy that she heard the church bells ringing down to her. The year afterwards, the second sister was allowed to rise up through the water and swim wherever she liked. She came up just as the sun was setting, and this was the sight she thought was the loveliest. The whole sky had looked like gold, she said. And as for the clouds, well, she had never done describing their loveliness. Red and violet they had been as they sailed over her. But far swifter than they, like a long white veil, was a flock of wild swans that had flown across the water against the sun. She swam towards it, but it sunk, and the rosy glow of the sea and the clouds had gone out. The year after that, the third sister came up. She was the boldest of them all, and swam up a wide river which flowed into the sea. There she saw lovely green hills with vines growing on them, and castles and manors peeping out from between splendid woods. She heard all the birds singing, and the sun was so hot that she often had to dive under the water just to cool her burning face. At a small bend, she met a whole crowd of little human children. They were running about and splashing in the water, and she wanted to play with them. But they were frightened and ran away, and a little black animal came up, a dog, one that she had never seen before, and it barked at her so dreadfully that she was scared and made for the open sea. But never could she forget the splendid woods, the green hills, and the pretty children who could swim in the water, though they had no fish's tail. The fourth sister was not so bold. She stayed in the middle of the wild ocean, and said that it was the loveliest. You could see for miles around you, and the sky above was like a big glass bell. She had seen ships, but far off, looking like seagulls. The funny dolphins had turned somersaults, and the big whales had spurted water from their nostrils, so that there seemed to be 100 waterfalls around about them. Then came the turn of the fifth sister. Her birthday happened to be in the winter, and so she saw what the others had not seen the first time. The sea looked quite green, and big icebergs were floating about, each like a pearl, she said, though much bigger than the church steeples which people built. They appeared in the most wonderful shapes, and sparkled like diamonds. She had sat on one of the biggest of them, and all the sailors had been frightened, and had steered clear of her as she sat with her hair streaming in the wind. Late that evening, the sky had become cloudy, and it had thundered and lightened, while the black sea had lifted the big blocks of ice into the air, gleaming in the flashes of lightning. All the ships had taken in their sails, and their crews had been filled with fear and dread. But she had calmly, on her floating iceberg, continued to sit, watching the blue lightning zigzag into the glistening sea. When one of the sisters rose above the surface for the first time, she would be delighted by all the new and beautiful things she saw. But as they grew up and were allowed to go wherever they liked, they no longer cared for it, and became homesick, saying after a month had gone by that the most beautiful place after all was down below, and that there one felt so nicely at home. Many an evening the 5 sisters would take one another by the arm and rise above the surface in a row. They had lovely voices, more beautiful than any human beings. And when a storm arose, and they thought that ships might be wrecked, they would swim in front of them, singing so beautifully about how grand it was at the bottom of the sea, and telling the sailors not to be afraid to come down. But the sailors would never understand the words. They would think it was the storm, and would never see the loveliness down there either. For when the ship sank, the people drowned, and were dead when they reached the Merman King's palace. On these evenings, when, arm in arm, the sisters rose right up to the surface, the little one would stay behind all by herself, gazing after them and looking as though she was going to cry. Only a mermaid has no tears, and so suffers all the more.
"Oh, if only I were 15,
she would say.
"I feel sure I shall love the world and the people who live and work in it."
At long last, she was 15.
There now, we're getting you off our hands,
said her grandmother, the old Queen Mother.
Now come along and let me smarten you up like your sisters.
And so on her head she placed a wreath of white lilies, each petal of which was half a pearl. Then the old lady got 8 big oysters to nip themselves fast to the prince's tail to show her rank.
"It does hurt,"
said the little mermaid.
Well, you can't have good looks without paying for them,
said the old lady. Oh, how she would have liked to shake off all this finery and give up the heavy wreath. The red flowers in her garden suited her much better, but she did not dare change.
"Goodbye,"
she said, and as lightly and delicately as a bubble, she floated up through the water. The sun had just set when she raised her head above the surface, but all the clouds were shimmering like roses and gold, and in the middle of the pink sky, the evening star shone out brightly and beautifully. The air was soft and mild, and the sea a dead calm. A big ship lay there with 3 masts, and only 1 sail up, for not a wind was stirring, and sailors were sitting in the rigging and on the yardarms. There was a sound of music and singing, and as the evening drew on, 100 colored lanterns were lit. It looked as though the flags of every nation were waving in the air. The little mermaid swam right up to the cabin window, and each time the waves lifted her up, she could see in through the crystal-clear panes to where many well-dressed people were standing. The handsomest among them was the young prince with the large dark eyes. He could not have been much over 16. It was his birthday, and that was why they were making all this show. Sailors were dancing on the deck, and when the young prince came out, over 100 rockets went up. They made it seem like broad daylight, and the little mermaid was so frightened that she dived under the water. But soon she popped her head up again, and then it seemed as though all the stars in the sky were falling down to her. She had never seen such fireworks. There were fireworks like spinning wheels going round and round, and like fishes soaring up in the air, and everything was reflected in the clear, calm sea. It was so light on the ship itself that you could see every little rope and the people very easily, What a handsome young prince he was! And he stood there shaking hands with the people, laughing and smiling, while the music rang out in the glorious night. It grew late, but the little mermaid could not take her eyes off the ship, and especially not off the lovely prince. The colored lanterns were put out, the rockets stopped going up, and there was no more gun firing. But deep down in the sea, there was a rumbling and a mumbling. All this time she sat on the waves, rocking up and down so that she could see into the cabin. But the ship began to move faster, one sail unfurling after the other. The waves were growing stronger now, big clouds were gathering, and it was thundering and lightning in the distance. A dreadful storm was coming on. And so the sailors took in the sails. The ship was pitching and racing along on the fierce sea, the waves rising like big black mountains, which seemed as though they would roll over the mast. But, dipping like a swan between the crests, the ship was lifted up again on mountainous waves. To the little mermaid, this speed seemed great fun. But the sailors did not think so. The ship creaked and groaned. The thick planks bulged under the heavy buffeting given them by the sea. The mast broke in two like a reed, and the ship rolled over on its side, water pouring into its windows. The little mermaid now saw that they were in danger, but she had to look out for herself, because planks and pieces of the ship were floating on top of the water. At one moment it would be so pitch dark that she could make out nothing at all. But when it lightened, it became so clear again that she could make out everyone on the ship. They were all managing as best they could. It was the young prince, though, that she looked for most of all, and she saw him as the ship split in two and sank deep down into the sea. At first she was very pleased, for now he would be coming down to her. But then she remembered that human beings cannot live in the water, and that he would never be able to come down to her father's palace unless he was dead. No, he mustn't die. And so she swam to him between beams and planks that were drifting on the surface, quite forgetting that they might have crushed her. Diving deep into the water, she rose up again between the waves, and so at last reached the young prince, who could scarcely swim any farther in the raging sea. His arms and legs were growing tired. His handsome eyes had closed, and he would have died had the little mermaid not come to him. Holding his head above the water, she allowed the waves to carry them wherever they would. By morning the storm was over. Of the ship there was not a scrap to be seen. The sun rose red and bright above the sea, and it seemed to bring life into the prince's cheeks, though his eyes were still closed. The mermaid kissed his deep, handsome forehead and brushed back his wet hair, thinking that he resembled the marble statue down in her garden. She kissed him again and again, and wished that he might live. And now before her she saw dry land, lofty blue mountains and tops which shone white with snow, as though swans nestled there. Down by the shore there were lovely green woods, and in front of them stood a church, or a convent, which it was she could not tell, but some kind of building like that. Lemon and orange trees were growing in the garden, and tall palm trees stood in front of the gateway. Now the sea here formed a small bay, which was perfectly calm but very deep right up to the cliff, where fine white sand had been washed in. Swimming to this with a handsome prince, she laid him on the sand, taking care to keep his head well up in the warm sunshine. The bells in the big white building now began to ring, and many young women came walking through the garden. At this, the little mermaid swam farther out, and, getting behind some big rocks that jutted out above the surface, she covered her hair with sea foam, so that no one would see her little face, and kept watch to see who would come to the poor prince. It was not long before a young woman came down. She seemed quite frightened, but only for a moment. Then she brought several persons, and the mermaid saw the prince revive, and smile to those who stood around him. He never smiled to her. But then, of course, he didn't know that she had saved him. She felt so very sad. And when he was led into the large building, she dived sorrowfully into the sea and made for her home in her father's palace. She who had always been quiet and thoughtful now became much more so. Her sisters asked her what she had seen on her first visit to the surface, but she told them nothing. Many an evening and many a morning she floated up to where she had left the prince. She saw the garden fruits ripen and be picked. She saw the snow melt on the lofty mountains. But she never saw the prince, and so always she returned home, sadder than ever. Her one consolation was to sit in the little garden and put her hands round the handsome marble statue, which was so like the prince. But she never tended her flowers. They grew like a wilderness, spreading over the paths and twining their long stalks and leaves in the tree branches, so that it was quite dark. In the end, she could bear it no longer. So she told one of her sisters, and then all the rest heard of it at once, though no more than they and a few other mermaids, who only told their best friends. One of them knew who the prince was. She, too, had seen the party on the ship. She knew where he was from, and where his kingdom lay.
"Come, little sister,"
said another princess, and with their arms round one another's shoulders, they floated in a long row to the surface, coming up in front of the prince's palace. This was built of shiny, bright yellow stone, with large marble steps, one flight leading straight down to the sea. Gorgeous domes towered above the roof, and between the pillars that surrounded the whole building there stood marble figures that looked alive. Through the clear glass in the tall windows could be seen splendid halls, hung with rich silk curtains and carpets. And all the walls were decorated with large paintings, delightful to look on. In the middle of the biggest hall, a large fountain was playing, the jets reaching up to the glass dome of the roof, through which the sun shone down on the water, and on the lovely plants growing in the big pool. Now she knew where he lived, and she came to the surface there many an evening and night, swimming much nearer land than any of the others had dared, often, indeed, right up to the narrow canal under the splendid marble balustrade which cast its long shadow across the water. Here she would sit watching the young prince, who would think himself quite alone in the bright moonlight. Many an evening she would see him sailing to music in his splendid boat, with flags flying. She would peep out from between green rushes, and if the wind caught her long silvery veil, and anyone chanced to see it, they would think it was the swan raising its wings. On many a night she would hear the fishermen lying with fires lit on the sea, telling such good things about the prince. And she was glad that she had saved his life when he had drifted half dead on the waves, and would remember how firmly his head had rested on her, and how warmly she had kissed him. He knew nothing at all of this, could never even dream of her. She grew more and more fond of human beings, wishing more and more that she could go up among them. Their world seemed much greater than hers. They could speed across the sea in ships, climb lofty mountains high above the clouds, and the countries they owned stretched as forests and fields farther than she could see. There was so much she wondered about. But her sisters didn't know the answers to all her questions, and so she asked her old grandmother. She knew all about the upper world, as she very properly called the lands above the sea.
"When human beings don't drown,"
asked the little mermaid.
"can they live forever? Don't they die like us down here below?"
Oh, yes.
Said the old lady.
They too have to die, and their life is even shorter than ours. But we can grow to be 300 years old. But when our life comes to an end, we become nothing but foam on the water, and never even have a grave among our loved ones. We have no immortal soul. We never have another life. We are like the green rush. Once it is cut, it can never grow green again. Human beings, however, have a soul which lives on forever, lives after the body has turned to dust. It soars up into the bright sky, up to all the shining stars. As we rise to the surface to see human countries, they rise to lovely unknown places, places we shall never see.
Why weren't we given an immortal soul?
asked the little mermaid sadly.
I'd give all my hundreds of years just to be a human being for one day and then get a place in this heavenly world.
You mustn't go thinking such things,
said the old lady.
We are much happier and much better off than the human beings up there.
And so I am to die and float like foam on the sea, never hearing the music of the waves or seeing the lovely flowers and the red sun? Is there nothing I can do to win an eternal soul?
No,
said the old lady.
Only if a human being were to love you so dearly that you were more to him than father and mother, if he were to cling to you with all his thoughts and affections, letting the clergyman place his right hand in yours and promising to be true to you here and forever, then his soul would flow into your body and you, too, would receive a share of human happiness. He would give you a soul and yet keep his own. But that can never be. The very thing that is so lovely here in the sea, your fish's tail, they think ugly up there on earth. They know no better. There you have two clumsy props called legs in order to be good-looking.
At this, the little mermaid sighed and looked sadly down at her fish's tail.
Let us be content,
said the old lady,
to leap and plunge in the 300 years we have to live. I'm sure it's a long enough time. Afterwards we can rest all the happier in our graves. Tonight we're having a court ball.
This, too, was a splendid sight such as we'd never see on earth. Walls and ceiling in the great ballroom were of thick but clear glass. Several hundred enormous cockle shells, rose red and grass green, were arranged in rows on either side, with a flaming blue fire which lit up the entire hall and shone out through the windows, making the sea outside quite light. You could see countless numbers of fishes, big and little ones, swimming toward the glass wall, some with scales glowing purple, others seeming to be silver and gold. Flowing through the middle of the hall was a wide stream of water, and on it danced mermen and mermaids to their own lovely singing. No human beings have such pretty voices. The little mermaid sang with the most beautiful song of all, and they clapped for her, so that for a moment she felt glad in her heart, knowing that she had the most beautiful voice of anyone on earth or in the sea. But soon her thoughts again turned to the world above her. She could not forget the handsome prince, and her grief at not having, like him, an immortal soul. And so she slipped out of her father's palace, and while all within was singing and merrymaking, she sat sorrowfully in her little garden. There, coming through the water, she heard the sound of a horn, and she thought,
I expect he's sailing in his ship up there. He whom I love more than father and mother, he to whom my thoughts cling, and in whose hand I would lay my life's happiness. I will venture everything to win him and an immortal soul. While my sisters are dancing in my father's palace, I'll go to the sea witch, the one I've always been afraid of. She may give me some help and advice.
And so the little mermaid set off from her garden for the roaring whirlpools where the witch lived. She had never gone that way before. No flowers and no sea grass grow there. In this place there is only the bare gray sand stretching over towards the whirlpools, which churned round like roaring mill wheels, dragging everything they caught hold of down into the deep. She had to pass right through these swirling waters to reach the sea witch's country, and for a long stretch the only way was over hot bubbling mud, which the witch called her peat bog. Behind it was her house, standing in the middle of a weird wood. All the trees and bushes in it were like polyps of coral, half animal, half plant. They looked like 100-headed snakes growing out of the ground. All the branches were long, slimy arms, with fingers like wiggling worms, moving joint by joint from the root to the tip. They twisted themselves tightly round everything they could catch hold of, and never let go again. The little mermaid was terrified as she stood outside there. Her heart was pounding with fear, and she almost turned back. But then she thought of the prince and of the human soul, and she plucked up her courage. Tying her long flowing hair firmly about her head, so that the polyp should not seize her by it, and laying her 2 hands across her breast, she flew along as the fish speeds through the water, in between the ugly polyps which stretched their waving arms and fingers after her. She saw how each of them held something it had seized, holding it with hundreds of little arms in a grip of iron. Human beings who had died at sea and sunk to the bottom were sticking out from the polyp's arms just like white skeletons. Ship's rudders and chests had been grasped, together with skeletons of land animals and a little mermaid they had caught and choked. This, she felt, was the most dreadful of all. Soon she came to a big, slimy clearing in the forest, where big fat sea snakes frisked about, showing their ugly, whitish-yellow stomachs. Standing in the middle of the clearing was a house built out of the bones of shipwrecked people. And here sat the sea witch, allowing a toad to eat out of her mouth, the way people will let a canary take a piece of sugar. The horrid fat sea snakes that she called little chicks were allowed to romp all over her.
"I know what you want,"
said the sea witch.
"It's very silly of you. Still, you shall have your way, and it'll bring you to mischief, my lovely princess. You want to get rid of your fish's tail, and instead have 2 stumps to walk on like human beings, so that the young prince will fall in love with you, and you can marry him and get an immortal soul."
And the witch gave such a loud and horrid laugh that the toad and the snakes dropped to the ground and lay there wallowing.
"You've come in the nick of time,"
said the witch.
"After the sun has risen tomorrow, I shouldn't be able to help you for another year. I'll make you a drink, and before the sun rises, you must swim ashore with it and sit on the shore and drink it. Your tail will then split in 2 and shrivel into what human beings call nice little legs. But it'll hurt, like having a sharp sword go through you. All who see you will say you are the loveliest girl they've ever seen. You'll keep your graceful movements, and no dancer will be as graceful. But every step you take will be like treading on a sharp knife that draws blood. If you're ready to suffer all this, I'm willing to help you."
Yes,
said the little mermaid in a trembling voice, thinking of the prince and of winning an immortal soul.
"But remember this,"
said the witch.
"when once you've gained human form, you can never more become a mermaid. You will never be able to come down into the sea to your sisters and your father's palace. And unless you win the prince's love so that he marries you and you become husband and wife, you will never win an immortal soul. The morning after he marries another, your heart will break and you will become foam on the water."
I'm willing,
said the little mermaid, turning as pale as death.
"But I want my payment as well,"
said the witch.
"and the charge I make isn't a small one. You have the loveliest voice of any at the bottom of the sea. You think you're going to charm him with it, but that voice you must give to me. The best you possess is my price for the precious drink. I shall make the drink as sharp as a 2-edged sword."
but when you take my voice,
said the little mermaid.
what shall I have left?
"Your lovely figure,
said the witch.
your graceful motions, and your expressive eyes. You should charm a human heart with those. Well, have you lost heart? Put out your little tongue, then I'll cut it off in payment, and you shall have the magic drink."
Very well,
said the little mermaid, and the witch put on her cauldron to boil the magic drink.
"Cleanliness is next to godliness,"
she said, wiping the cauldron with the snakes, which she tied into a knot. The steam formed the weirdest shapes, which were enough to make anyone frightened. The witch kept on putting fresh things into the cauldron, so that when it was properly boiling, it was like a crocodile shedding tears. At last, the drink was ready, and then it looked like pure water.
"There you are, then,"
said the witch, and she took the little mermaid's voice, so that she could not talk nor sing.
"If the polyp should seize you on your way back through the wood,"
said the witch,
"just throw one drop of this drink on them, and their arms and fingers will snap into 1,000 pieces."
But there was no need for the little mermaid to do this. The polyps shrank from her in fear when they saw the bright drink, which glistened in her hand like a sparkling star. And so she soon got through the wood, the swamp, and the roaring whirlpools. She could see her father's palace. The fires in the big ballroom were out, and she thought they must have all been asleep there, though she did not dare to look for them. She could not speak now, and she was leaving them forever. She was almost heartbroken with grief. She went into the garden, took one flower from each sister's flower bed, and, throwing 1,000 kisses in the direction of the palace, floated up finally through the dark blue sea. The sun had not yet come out when she saw the prince's palace and climbed the splendid marble stairs. The moon was shining beautifully. The little mermaid drank the burning sharp drink, and it was just as if a two-edged sword had passed through her delicate body. She fainted and lay as though dead. When the sun shone out across the sea, she woke up, feeling a burning pain. But there, in front of her, stood the lovely young prince, looking upon her with his jet-black eyes. Casting her own eyes down, she saw that her fish's tail was gone, and that she had the nicest little white legs any girl could ever have. And so she wrapped herself in a mass of long hair, for she had no clothes. The prince asked who she was and how she had gotten there, and she looked at him sweetly, though sadly, with her dark blue eyes, of course, but she could not speak. Then, taking her by the hand, he led her into the palace. Every step she took felt as the witch had told her that it would, like treading on pointed needles and sharp knives. But she bore the pain gladly. Holding the prince's hand, she rose as lightly as a bubble, and he and everyone else marveled at her graceful gliding walk. Rich dresses of silk and muslin were given to her to put on. She was the most beautiful woman in the palace. But she could not talk, neither could she sing. Lovely slave girls clad in silk and gold came forward and sang for the prince and his royal parents. There was one who sang more beautifully than all the rest, and the prince clapped his hands and smiled at her. It made the little mermaid so sad, because she knew that she had sung in the past far more beautifully than her. She thought,
If only he knew that I had given my voice away forever so as to be with him.
The slave girls then danced in graceful gliding dances to the most glorious music. And seeing them, the little mermaid lifted up her pretty white arms, raised herself on tiptoe, and then glided across the floor, dancing as no one had ever yet danced. At every movement, her loveliness became even more striking, and her eyes spoke more deeply to the heart than the singing of the slave girls. Everyone was delighted by it, especially the prince, who called her his little foundling. And so she danced more and more, though every time her foot touched the ground, it was like treading on sharp knives. The prince said that she was always to be with him, and she was allowed to sleep outside his door on a velvet cushion. He got her to make men's clothes, so that she could go with him on horseback. They would ride through the sweetly scented woods, where green branches would touch her shoulders, and little birds sang behind the fresh leaves. With the prince, she climbed high mountains, and though her delicate feet would bleed for all to see, she would laugh and follow him until the clouds were set sailing beneath them like a flock of birds making their way to foreign lands. At home in the prince's palace, In the night, when the others were asleep, she would go out onto the broad marble steps, and it would cool her burning feet to stand in the cold seawater. Then she would think of those down below. One night her sisters came up arm in arm, singing so sadly as they swam across the water. She waved at them, and they knew her, and told her how unhappy she had made them all. They visited her every night after that, and one night she saw, a long way out, her old grandmother, who hadn't been above the surface for many years, together with the Merman King wearing his crown. They stretched their hands towards her, but didn't venture so near land as her sisters. She grew fonder of the prince day by day. His fondness of her was like one that loves a good sweet child. But the idea of making her his queen had never entered into his head. And his wife she had to be, otherwise she would never get an immortal soul, but on his wedding morning would become foam on the sea.
Don't you like me most of any of them?
The little mermaid's eyes seemed to say when he took her in his arms and kissed her pretty forehead.
Yes, you are dearest to me,
Said the prince.
for you are the best-hearted of them all. You are the most devoted to me, and you remind me of a young woman I once saw, but am never likely to see again. I was on a ship which was wrecked. The waves washed me ashore by a holy temple, where some young women served. The youngest of them found me by the shore and saved my life. I saw her only twice. She is the only woman in the world I could love. But you are like her, and you have nearly taken her place in my heart. She belongs to the holy temple, and so good fortune has sent me you. We will never part.
Alas, he doesn't know that I saved his life.
Thought the little mermaid.
I took him across the sea to the wood where the holy temple stands, and hid behind the foam, watching to see if anyone would come. I saw the beautiful young woman he loves more than me.
And the mermaid gave a deep sigh. She could not cry.
The young woman belongs to the holy temple, or so he says. She'll never come out into the world. They'll never meet again. I am with him, seeing him every day. I'll care for him, love him, give my life to him.
But now the prince was to marry, and to have the lovely daughter of the neighboring king for his wife, so the people said. That was why he was fitting out such a splendid ship.
The prince is going to see the land of our neighboring king, they say, but it's to see the neighboring king's daughter. He's taking many attendants with him.
But the little mermaid shook her head and laughed. She knew the prince's mind much better than all the rest.
I must go.
He said to her.
I must see the beautiful princess. My parents insist on it, but they shall never make me bring her home as my bride. I'll never love her. She doesn't remind me of the beautiful young woman in the temple as you do. If ever I choose a bride, it's more likely to be you, my speechless child with the expressive eyes.
And then he kissed her red lips, played with her long hair, and laid his head on her heart, making it dream of human happiness and an immortal soul.
Why, you don't seem afraid of the sea, my speechless child,
He said, as they stood on the splendid ship that was to take him to the lands of the neighboring king. And he told her of the storms and calm weather, of weird fishes in the sea, and of whatever the diver had seen there. She smiled at him at all that he told, knowing, of course, more about the bottom of the sea than anyone. In the moonlit night, when everyone was asleep apart from the ship's mate, who stood at the helm, she would sit by the rail, gazing into the clear water, and imagining that she saw her father's palace. Her old grandmother would be nearest, wearing her silver crown and gazing up through the swift currents toward the ship's keel. Then she imagined her sisters rising to the surface, gazing sorrowfully at her, and wringing their white hands. She would wave to them, smiling, wanting to tell them that she was quite well and happy. But then the cabin boy would come along, and the sisters would dive below, leaving him to think that the white that he had seen was the foam on the sea. Next morning, the ship sailed into the harbor of the neighboring king's splendid city. The church bells were all ringing, and trumpets were blown from the tall towers as soldiers stood with flags flying and bayonets flashing. every day was celebrating. Balls and parties followed one another, but the princess wasn't there yet. She was being educated, they said, in a long way off, in a holy temple where she was learning all the royal virtues. At long last, she arrived. The little mermaid was eager to see how beautiful she was, and she was forced to admit that she had never seen a more graceful figure. Her skin was so pure and delicate, and smiling behind long dark eyelashes, there were two blue-black, steadfast eyes.
"It's you,"
Said the prince,
"you who saved me when I lay almost dead on the shore."
and he clasped his blushing bride in his arms.
"Oh, how overjoyed I am!
He said to the little mermaid,
The best thing I never dared hope for has come true for me. You will be glad at my good fortune, for you are fonder of me than any of them."
and the little mermaid kissed his hand, while all the time she felt that her heart would break. His wedding morning would bring death to her, changing her into foam in the sea. The church bells all rang. The heralds rode through the streets proclaiming the wedding. Sweet scented oils in rich silver lamps burned on every altar. The priests swung their incense vessels, and the bride and bridegroom held hands, and they were blessed. The little mermaid, dressed in silk and gold, stood holding the bridal train, but her ears were deaf to the music, her eyes blind to the ceremony, because she was thinking of her last night and of everything in this world that she had lost. That very evening, the bride and the bridegroom went aboard the ship. Guns were fired, flags were waved, and in the middle of the ship was pitched a royal tent of gold and purple, with the loveliest of cushions for the bridal couple to sleep on in the cool, still night. The sails swelled in the breeze, and the ship glided lightly and easily across the clear ocean. As darkness fell, lamps of many colors were lit, and the sailors danced merry dances on the deck. The little mermaid was reminded of the first time she had come to the surface and had seen that same splendor and rejoicing. And she reeled in the dance herself, gliding as the swallow glides when it is being chased, while all cried out in admiration for she had never danced so splendidly. It was as if sharp knives cut into her feet. Though she never felt them, they cut more painfully into her heart. She knew this was the last evening that she would see the one for whom she had left her home and her family, giving up her lovely voice and daily suffering endless pains all unknown to him. It was the last night she would breathe the air that he breathed, or see the deep ocean or the starry blue sky. An everlasting night, mindless and dreamless, awaited her who had no soul and had no hope of winning one. On the ship, everyone was rejoicing and merrymaking well into the night, while she laughed and danced with the thought of death in her heart. The prince kissed his lovely bride, and she played with his black hair, and arm in arm, they went to rest in the splendid tent. The ship grew hushed and silent, with only the mate at the helm, as the little mermaid laid her white hands on the rail and looked eastward for the dawn, knowing that the first ray of daylight would kill her. All at once, she saw her sisters coming to the surface, as pale as she was herself. Their beautiful long hair had no longer streamed in the wind. It had been cut off.
We gave it to the witch so that she would bring help that will save you from dying tonight. She gave us a knife. Here it is. See how sharp it is.
Before the sun rises, you must stab it into the prince's heart, and when his warm blood splashes your feet, they will grow together into a fish's tail, and you'll be a mermaid again, able to come down below to us and live out your 300 years before becoming dead salt sea foam.
Hurry! He or you must die before the sun rises.
Our old grandmother is so full of grief that her white hair has fallen out, as ours fell to the witch's scissors.
Kill the prince and come back. Hurry! Don't you see the red strip in the sky?
In a few minutes the sun will rise and you must die.
And, giving a strange deep sigh, they sank into the waves. The little mermaid drew back the purple curtain from the tent door and saw the lovely bride asleep, with her head on the prince's chest, and stooping down, she kissed him on his beautiful forehead, looked up at the sky where the dawn was growing brighter and brighter, looked at the sharp knife, and again turned her gaze on the prince, who murmured in his dreams the name of his bride. She alone was in his thoughts, and the hand that held the knife trembled. But then, all at once, she threw it far into the waves, which shone red where it fell, as though drops of blood were trickling from the water. Once more she looked, with half-glazed eyes, at the prince. She then plunged into the sea, feeling her body melt into foam as she did so. The sun now rose from the sea, its beams falling gently and warmly on the deadly cold foam. The little mermaid had no feeling of death, but saw the bright sun and, soaring above her, hundreds of lovely, transparent creatures. Through them she could see the ship's white sails and the red clouds in the sky. Their voice was music, but so spiritual that no human ear could hear it, just as no earthly eye could see them. They glided through the air without wings by their own lightness. The little mermaid saw that she had a body like theirs, which rose higher and higher out of the foam.
"Who's coming for me?"
she said, and her voice sounded like that of other beings, so spiritual that no earthly music can reproduce it.
The daughters of the air! A mermaid never has an immortal soul and can never get one unless she wins the love of a human being. Her everlasting life depends on a strange power. The daughters of the air have no everlasting soul either, but by good deeds they can create one for themselves. We fly to the hot countries where the warm, plague-filled air kills human beings, and there we create cool breezes. We spread through the air the scent of flowers, bringing refreshment and healing. When for 300 years we have striven to do all the good we can, we get an immortal soul and share in the eternal happiness of human beings. You have striven, poor little mermaid, with all your heart for the same as we have striven for. You have suffered and borne and have raised yourself up into the world of the aerial spirits. Now, through your own good deeds, you can create an immortal soul for yourself in 300 years' time.
And, lifting her clear arms toward God's heaven, the little mermaid, for the first time, felt tears. There was noise and bustle on the ship again, and she saw the prince with his beautiful bride gazing sadly at the bubbling foam as though they knew that she had plunged into the waves. Invisible now, she kissed the bride's forehead, smiled to the prince, and, with the other children of the air, soared up onto the rose-red cloud which was sailing above.
In 300 years, we shall float like this into God's heaven.
We can get there even earlier.
One of them whispered.
We float invisibly into human houses where there are children, and for every day on which we find a good child who pleases his parents and earns their love, God shortens our time of trial. The child never knows when we fly through the room, and when we smile with pleasure at him, a year is taken off the 300. But if we see a naughty and wicked child, then we must weep tears of sorrow, and each tear adds a day to our time of trial.